Well, first of all, before the dollar was the reserve currency, all those other currencies that you mentioned were backed by gold. I mean, they weren't just fiat. I mean, the dollar is the first currency in history to achieve that status as pure fiat currency.
How did the monetary system start? Before the dollar was the reserve currency, and the world had come up with a number of other currencies, different for every country. Everything was backed by gold. Fiat had no value of its own. In fact, the dollar was the first currency in history to achieve the status as pure fiat currency, one that had no real money behind it for the very first time. And so, what do you think will happen in a world where no central banks currently issue legitimate currency? Basically, the legitimate currency is that gold will again be backing all the fiat once more. We will go back to the situation that the world was in before the dollar. And in fact, when the dollar originally became the world's reserve currency, it was backed by gold still for a long time. In fact, it was redeemable in gold on demand. It would not even have got the fiat status if it was not for Nixon.
I think that when the dollar is no longer the main reserve for all those fiat currencies, they're not just going to pick another fiat currency to replace the dollar.
So now, after so many years, when nobody is actually issuing any legitimate currency, where every central bank has just got fiat, you would be able to realize that when the dollar is no longer the main reserve for all those fiat currencies, they are not just going to pick another fiat currency to replace the dollar. It would not make any sense to just go to the euro or to even go to the yen, because at the end of the day, they are just paper too. So you'd think that the dollar's demise is going to introduce the monetization of gold. Not that it was ever democratized by central banks, because central banks hold all gold to some degree. But probably gold is going to replace the dollar as the primary reserve asset for all central banks. Even the government holds gold, so that they can claim that they have a certain amount of gold, whether or not you want to believe them. But let's assume that they're being honest. How long will they be able to hold on to that gold? Because we're going to now have to start paying for our imports with gold in the new old world. We have a huge trade deficit, and our trading partners, if we don't have real goods, we're going to have to ship some gold out to pay for our imports. So, it's not like the gold supply is going to last very long in the world that we have now. And also the US government, if they're going to run deficits where they know they're going to have to start spending gold.
In the new world, where gold is a reserve, if they want something, they need the gold to pay for it, right? They either have to tax the citizens and get, their gold, which is, backing their currency, or they're going to have to, start dipping into their reserves.
Right now, all they have to do is print money. So if the government wants something, they just need to print money and they can get it. But in the new world, where gold is the reserve, if they want something, they need the gold to pay for it. Which means that they will have to either tax the citizens to get their gold, which is backing their currency, or they're going to have to start dipping into their own reserves, which would further mean that the US gold reserve can be depleted very quickly if we need that gold to pay for. You see, right now, we don't need anything to pay for anything. America is the biggest beneficiary of the dollar's fatter because let's say you take a small country, let's say you take New Zealand, wants to import. It cannot just print. The New Zealand dollar isn't the reserve currency, so it has to earn dollars in order to buy things that the dollar denominated. But here is America, which does not need to earn any of it. They just need to print and pay. But imagine if they had to start earning just like everybody else in the other countries. They will literally go from having to simply print something to earning something, and it's a lot harder to earn than to print. Due to this printing ability, you could say that the American citizens have been living beyond their means for a long time. And that means that citizens in other countries, by definition, must be living beneath their means to make this possible.
I think the dollar's demise is going to introduce the remonetization of gold. Not that it was ever demonetized by central banks, because central banks all hold gold to some degree. But I think gold is going to replace the dollar as the primary reserve asset for all central banks.
But as the printing goes on and starts to lose value, the emerging market consumers that are bearing the brunt of this lifestyle subsidy will be free when the dollar collapses and the Americans are no longer living above their means, as they now have to earn everything they spend. They would no longer be consuming nearly as much stuff, which will then disrupt the demand-supply curve and hence probably lead to a downward trend in prices too. And the customers for these things are then going to be found in the emerging markets. So it's like a giant weight is lifted from their shoulders, and now they're in much better shape. It is very true that right now governments are desperate and they are doing desperate things. Why? Because if we have been right all along about what is going to happen to the dollar in the future, as more and more Americans become cognizant of the risk of inflation, they will take action to protect themselves, and ways that they do that are by buying gold and by buying foreign assets, getting into foreign currencies. Some people may do that by buying Bitcoin too. But that will be a mistake, because if you look at inflation as a tax, which is really what it is, then the government can either take your money officially as a tax, or they can just print money, which also means that they are taxing you by inflation. Because what they are doing is that they are reducing the value of your paper assets, and on the other hand, transferring that value to whoever is the recipient of those spending. And if you want to avoid the inflation tax, you will need to not hold the US dollars. You get rid of them as fast as you can to try to avoid the tax, because the tax is on dollars or dollar-denominated assets. So if somebody has a bunch of savings in bonds and they sell the bonds, and they put that money in gold bullion, they're exempt from the inflation tax on that money. Then, even if the government says that they have to close these tax breaks, we have to try to prevent Americans from avoiding the inflation tax by getting out of dollars. The way they would do that is either they outright ban the purchase of these inflation hedges, or they tax the purchase in such a way as to make the transactions prohibitively expensive. So they put in foreign exchange controls where they can, or they find ways. So it certainly is possible that in the near future, if things really start to get bad and more people perceive the threat, that the government will try to do something to prevent them from getting that shelter. But right now, not that many people understand this threat, and so now is the best time to start investing in gold as much as you can before the competition arrives. Right now, only the small number of people are buying gold and buying real assets, which means that right now, there's no taxes, which is another reason to do it now, because they can impose the taxes retroactively. Start thinking about it and maybe plan the moves ahead while you still have it easy.
I think is going to happen in a world where no central banks currently issue legitimate currency, right? Legitimate currency would be currency backed by gold, real money. That is the situation that the world was in before the dollar. And in fact, when the dollar originally became the world's reserve currency, it was backed by gold. In fact, it was redeemable in gold on demand.